Hello, this podcast is recorded on Gadigal country and we pay our respects to the First Nations custodians of the land, both here and also wherever you're listening from. Okay, we have been wanting to get together for a while to talk about something that is kind of tricky terrain, and because we both were just so shocked by it, and should probably say off the top, even though, as you know, I hate a trigger warning, we're about to be talking about issues to do with sexual abuse and things of this nature, so if you don't want to listen, jump off now. Alice Munro, the Canadian novelist, she died not long ago.
Age 92, good old age. Mm-hmm.
And her daughter wrote a piece to say, I was sexually abused by my stepfather and my mother, Alice Munro, did not leave him, even though she was fully aware of it. And then the New York Times went and kind of investigated. They went to Alice Munro's biographer who said, yeah, I was aware of that. I interviewed Alice Munro about this. We talked about it. She told me she knew of this and had chosen to remain with her husband. I chose to not write about it because I feel like all families have got secrets.
And he said also I wasn't writing that kind of biography.
And the daughter's view was, well, nobody would listen to me because my mother was too powerful and too revered globally as a Booker Prize-winning novelist, and no one wanted to hear my story of what happened to me was very inconvenient. And also it wasn't in any doubt whatsoever. There were admissions that had been made.
He'd been convicted.
Yeah. So then
and how did that not get reported at the time? I mean, anyway.
It's quite gobsmacking. So I
suppose in cases of child sex abuse, identities are often cloaked. So I assume that that's what happened.
Yeah.
Because he was convicted. And for context, the daughter was 9 at the time. So, not that any age is, it's very shocking.
So again, we're in that terrain that we've been in before, which is, can you read or enjoy Alice Munro knowing this? I find this just so, I can't actually even wrap my head around that.
We were both in London when the news broke, and I was just absolutely, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I actually had on our sort of weird little list that we keep of things that you've listened to and read and whatever, I had just listened to on the advice of a friend of ours on the New Yorker fiction podcast, which is great, by the way. It's just called Fiction. And what they do is they get a well-known writer to select a short story or piece of writing by another well-known writer, and they read it and then discuss it with the New Yorker's fiction editor. And I had just listened to André Alexis, who's a Canadian writer, reading out what's the name of the Before the Change, which is an Alice Munro short story that she published in the New Yorker a few years ago. And so I just read and found that story incredibly moving, as Munro short stories so often are, and they often are in the heads of women to whom terrible things are happening, who find themselves in this sort of place in their lives where they're out of control or they're, and to find that Munro herself was sort of like sitting on this sort of situation where she seems to have behaved badly, and her husband, who's also dead, behaved like a monster. It seems to have dropped this real depth charge into the pool of Alice Munro reading people, right? Like, we're in a chat group with a number of female writers, and I would say that there's a strong feeling of I will never read another short story by Alice Munro. Whereas I find, now that I've had like a couple of weeks to reflect on it, I feel exactly the opposite. I feel like I want to go back and read everything.
To try to get an explanation, do you feel like? Or what's driving you to do that?
I think, there's this sense, I reckon, and I understand, the thought of somebody hearing from their child that this had happened to them and having it confirmed, and then according to the daughter's recollection, her mother said to her, I hate that the patriarchal system means that I have to make myself unhappy because of something terrible that my husband did.
Wow.
Which is, look, I like to think that that is absolutely not how I would respond in a situation like that. And I think everybody can agree that that's a shocking thing to learn that a human would be capable of responding like that.
I read something a while ago, and I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but they said that there's two kinds of families. There's the family in which the mum and dad's relationship is the central relationship and the kids know that they're secondary, that the mum and dad prefer each other. And then there's relationships where the kids know that the parents' relationship with the kids supersedes the relationship between the mum and the dad. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I think perhaps one of the reasons I find that the Alice Munro thing so egregious is I cannot fathom that you would choose your husband over your child.
Or continue to be presumably in a sexual relationship with somebody, you know, who had done something so monstrous. And his letters about it are foul, like they're referred to by the daughter, who I feel so desperate for because she's clearly, it's the loneliest thing you could imagine. You know, you've told people and you've told, you know, your mother, you've told your mother's biographer, and they've all just gone, yeah, you know.
And not saying it's not difficult terrain because, you know, the publishers and whatnot probably, I mean, I would like to think there was a kind of some difficult discussions around it because clearly you don't want to punish Alice Munro for something that her husband did, but also it's the truth and it did actually happen. So
and
it does seem, and in the daughter's view, it was like there was a protection racket kind of around this.
Well, that seems amply demonstrated. I just think it's interesting. I think that, you know how we felt when Louis C.K., you know, because we'd loved that TV series so much and got a sense of him as a male person who had these sort of antennae into sort of male behaviour, like, and that it was sort of a particularly excoriating eye that he turned on himself and on masculinity and stuff like. So there was this sense that you're a good guy, don't you think?
Yeah.
But that's what made, and I felt like I can't watch Louis C.K. again just because I feel like the intimacy of that relationship that I felt I had with him and my admiration for him was sort of perforated by the sense that he would like abuse his power over people. But I don't know. People, I've read a lot of women particularly or heard them say, I thought Alice Munro was on our side. Like I thought that she was, you know, a voice that described the experience of women experiencing abuse and neglect and whatever. And she made me believe that she was, you know, a person who sided with people to whom this sort of stuff happens. And this is shocking because she has deliberately not sided with someone to whom something terrible's happened, and it's her daughter.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether a close reading of Alice Munro's short stories actually bears out the proposition that she's kind of like this lovely person. Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, a bunch of her characters are people who find themselves in, like, doing terrible things as well as having terrible things done to them. Like, there's a sort of amorality about a lot of her characters that makes, I don't know, I think when I think about it closely, I don't think that really shatters my image of what sort of person Alice Munro is. I do admire her capacity to sort of like turn towards sort of clotted and complicated human behaviour and complicity and people in positions of responsibility doing bad things.
Which maybe she was doing because she was working through, or that was present in her life, so it's coming out in her writing in different ways. I mean, I suspect probably I would be able to read Alice Munro in a way that I find it hard to watch Louis because every time you watch Louis, you see Louis, and so I'm constantly reminded of that. Whereas obviously if you're reading a book, you know, you can kind of let go of, it doesn't, you know, the writing's just there in black and white. You don't necessarily have to be thinking these are the words of Alice Munro or whoever it is. So, you know, I don't think it would have the same effect on me. But certainly, as you say, some of our friends who are great fans of Alice Munro are like, I'll never read another word.
Just hard no. Yeah. And I don't like, I despise what she did, absolutely despise it, and I feel incredibly sorry for the daughter who has paid this shocking price and then been ignored, which happens a lot to people with family sex abuse. Like it's, but I don't mean to put a but in there. There's no but after that at all. I would say that, and I'm interested in tracing maybe what all of this stuff contributed to the things that she was writing. Like I read for the first time a short story that our friend Seb told me about like years and years ago, called Dimensions. And what he told me about this story made me think, I don't want to read that because it's so horrendous. So the story is about a woman who's married with 3 children, and her husband does something terrible to the children. And, and I thought, just one of those things I couldn't read for a while, like The Child in Time by Ian McEwan, where, it's about a father losing his child in the supermarket. I'm like, I can't cope with it. But I went back and read it, and I found, that it was absorbing, but I read it thinking, I wonder if this is what she was doing to kind of rid herself of the haunted awareness, because this story is written after these events. Don't know. And there's such a kind of sticky, kind of viscous, foul-smelling kind of sense of complicity, because in this short story, the husband does the worst possible thing and he's in prison, and the woman goes to visit him not knowing why she's visiting him. She hates him, but at the same time, she says, like, nobody wants to talk to me because I've had the worst thing happen to me that could happen to any mother, so nobody wants to look me in the eye. And he's the greatest monster of all time, and we sort of have this thing in common where only we understand what's happened, Anyway,
oh man,
it's really full
on. Yeah, that was a sort of shocking thing. And then there's also this stuff that's come out which seems a bit, frankly, a lot greyer than the Alice Munro thing, about Neil Gaiman, the writer.
Yeah, so Neil Gaiman's he's an unbelievably famous British-born writer, and his books have been made into movies like Sandman. He's a huge kind of like YA writer, sort of sci-fi, and just unbankably famous, right? And so there's a podcast called Slow News, one of the hosts of which is Rachel Johnson, and they've done this sort of 4-part podcast, maybe three, on some allegations against Neil Gaiman by some young women that say one of them was his kid's nanny, that they were in a sexual relationship with Neil Gaiman that was not consensual, or the degree of roughness of the sex wasn't consensual. Anyway, it's a really, I found it really interesting to listen to, and I was unsure by the end of whether it should have been made.
Yeah, I've not listened to it, but when you were explaining it to me, I felt like, okay, right, so they're basically consensual relationships, but then in hindsight, the women's vibe was, oh, well, actually, maybe it went a bit further than I wanted it to. And then I just felt like journalistically, wow, that's a bold call to run an allegation publicly that is going to absolutely destroy somebody's reputation when it seems very murky and unclear.
Well, I mean, and I think that the reason that they made the podcast was to look at, and these sort of alleged, all these instances had occurred in different countries, and so they have a look at, what is, for instance, the legal situation around B&D sex? Like, what are the consents around that? Like, if you've consented to sex with somebody and then it turns like a lot rougher than you had anticipated, well, what are the ancillary consent issues around that? And in both of these cases, the women are interviewed, and they both say yes during that time. I was messaging back and forth and saying you're amazing, and and in the case of one of them who was sort of the nanny, she'd said, oh, thanks for an amazing evening and so on. So it's this
See,
sort
that
of,
for me alone would be like, well, I don't think we can run that story.
well, that's what the cop's response was. Oh, well,
Right.
no, well, that was the response of the police. Yeah, I don't know. Like I think I'm sort of interested in this question of what happens when writers that you know and admire are kind of sucked into these kind of sticky moral situations. And we've talked about this a million times, but normally we're talking about, comedians or film stars or, sports people or whatever, like writers. I don't know if I feel differently about writers. I'm not a fan I'm not a fan of Neil Gaiman anyway. I probably would never be, but
No, but I guess the difference with the Alice Munro thing and the Neil Gaiman thing is the Neil Gaiman thing, are accusations that are unproven and where there's a lot of contradictory evidence or fact or takes on it. Whereas the Alice Munro one seems like
it's very. I mean, no one disputes the facts of the situation. But one thing that the whole thing, particularly with Alice Munro, made me reflect on is how interesting it has been to watch the rusted-on fans of Alice Munro, who tend to be book-reading women, who read it and go, like, this is a field of storytelling that, like, reaches its fingers deep into the psyche of women and their responses to situations, even when outwardly they're saying things are fine, what's happening inside, which is, comparing that, and the comparison, the widespread response has been, I can't pick up another Alice Munro book, I can't forgive her. And it's weird because the husband who actually did all the worst stuff, I mean, maybe everyone's just like, well, obviously everybody hates him, but like he's sort of hardly ever mentioned.
Yeah.
Like she's like her and her mothering and her whatever is sort of front and centre, like the failure is hers. And I agree that the failure is hers, but like the greater failure is the husband's. Anyway, park that for a second. I just compare it to some of the male left-wing writers that I've heard in recent months, like really being angry about that Anna Funder book about George Orwell.
Oh, yeah.
Wifedom. Which it's sort of, I've just a couple of times now, actually half a dozen times, I've read or been in a conversation with a kind of a writer who's a left-wing sort of generally man, really exercised to such a, like, to a really like angry about the sort of slurs cast upon Orwell in Anna Funder's book, where she just basically looks at all of these biographies of Orwell and says none of them really mention the role that his wife played or like what an asshole he was to her. But see, I can't imagine why that's upsetting, because I think it's perfectly routine for artists and writers to be less than perfect people. It doesn't mean that the road to Wigan Pier isn't great.
I guess if you're a fan of Orwell, you feel like, well, he was a man of his times, and so why, who cares? Like, he's a genius. Like, I don't know. But
it's interesting to me, and maybe I'm just sort of one of those. I always see things through a gender lens, which is why some people find me so annoying. But like, just like, thank you, shut up now.
Which is why dudes who are upset about Anna Funder's George Orwell book seek you out in a way that no one's mentioned it to me whatsoever.
I know. I've had a number of crying men just going, but why? He's a genius. I'm like, yes, of course he's a genius. Love, nobody disputes that. It's all right. Just because he made his wife clean out the shitter and tried to root all her friends, like, still, like, Animal Farm's still great. Wow, she really helped with that book, by the way. Anyway, but like, I don't feel violated personally, and I think it's interesting to me that Alice Munro's female readership is like, oh my God, Alice Munro, you've let me down, get out of here. Whereas like, from my tiny and not very scientific sample, the Orwell dudes are like, get your hands off my beautiful George Orwell.
But again, it's a take on George Orwell. It's not the definitive truth on George Orwell. It's a take.
No, of course not. So. But the idea that you can't allow your literary hero to be violated in any way is just like it's so babyish.
You come from Ryan Reynolds and you are going down.
I'm taking them down.
Can I just finish before we go on a cheerier kind of podcast that I've been really enjoying? The Rest is Politics US with Anthony Scaramucci and Katty Kay. Katty Kay is a BBC reporter, and the Mooch was for, I think, about 6 or 7 days Donald Trump's press secretary. He was that dude who would wear the mirrored sunglasses and just seemed so out there. But
he was like a cop from Terminator or something.
He's just wildly entertaining, and he's still very connected to that wing of the Republican Party, and so his insights are actually really great. And he's just such good talent. He speaks in such a compelling way, and his chemistry with Katty Kay is fantastic, and it is just a really interesting take on American politics.
I've got to say, The Rest is franchise is my Marvel franchise. Like, I will listen to anything that those people make. Like, so The Rest is politics. The Rest is entertainment, of course, with Marina and your friend Richard Osman. My God,
and The Rest is
your
politics.
crush on Richard Osman is outrageous, and my husband's crush on Marina Hyde is like, he's constantly listening. Ever since he met her, he's got this massive crush and like is constantly listening to her podcast in the car and stuff. He's like, oh, Marina was so funny the other day. He's like, oh God, she's so clever and such a good writer. I'm like, yeah, imagine being married to someone like that.
Who would want to be?
Never mind.
Can I give a quick shout out to our upcoming shows? Melbourne on 1st of November, that is our actual 10th. I know we said London was our 10th anniversary show, but this actually coincides date-wise with our 10th anniversary. Arts Centre in Melbourne, we've got some amazing guests locked in. You don't want to miss it. You can get the tickets on the Arts Centre Melbourne website. Perth, September the 15th, Perth Concert Hall. Tickets on Ticketmaster or the Concert Hall website. Also going to be a hoot like the Perth shows normally are.
Oh my God, always. And usually one of us is physically impaired in some way. So like, stand by. If nothing's come up until, 24 hours before, I'll maim sales, don't you worry.
Hope to see you there.
Thank you for enjoying both the oral and the visual experience of me talking to this lady here. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for so much more content. It'll probably quell your enthusiasm, but give us a go or listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you ever think that we'd be telling people to subscribe to our content?
No, I did not.
We're cool at last.
Don't. You're making me look bad in front of my children. Again.